As Natalie said, my name is Aaron Kennedy. I'm the founder, CEO, and CTO of Outway. I was born here in Boulder. I grew up on a farm out by Munson Corn Farm, if you're familiar with where that is. And at a very young age, I was a junior ranger and junior naturalist for OSMP. I worked in and around the city. I did everything from the community education programs, specifically on arachnids, and was very close and well known within the butterfly pavilion community and them at an early age. I moved my career in education into technology. I specialized in large data systems, AI and machine learning. I've built and deployed over 20 products at this point, and ended up being very grateful and with the opportunity to bring my skills back to my passion and collaborate that around technology for land management. So with Outway, very simply put, Outway is the technology for the people behind nature. When I say that, I am talking about groups like land managers, nonprofits, people who are working in the field on natural areas. Outway was born out of the National Science Foundation's Innovation Corps program. We were in there for 2 years with 2 different grants from them and the University of Washington. We have presented that research with CPW Partners Conference as well as the Colorado Open Space and Alliance Conference twice. We have 9 early stage customers, all here in Colorado. But why am I here? I love this question that Natalie posed, and I'm going to focus almost entirely on answering this question, which is what is the role and the importance of data in decision-making in the outdoors? Because sometimes that is not as clear of an answer as we'd like it to be. Here in Colorado, I always like to say it's in our nature that we connect with these outdoor places. We have unbelievable memories, whether that's hiking with friends, camping with family, out in the backcountry, going out on ranches, whatever it is. There's so many different types of ways that we can connect with nature here in this state, and we are really lucky to have that access. More than just like a pleasure, statistically, we are an outlier within a state. We have 92%, according to OEdit, of residents who recreate outdoors every year. That is an unbelievable percentage of our populace that are outside all of the time. Outdoor recreation as an economy, as I'm sure you all have studied multiple times, is a huge fuel for our state, fuels our jobs, fuels the state's GDP and annual sales. This is all outdoor recreation, and it is not land management. So who are the people who actually take care of this? Who are the people who build the trails, fight wildfires, invasive species, and protect our biodiversity? I often have to spend most of this presentation introducing who these people even are, because not everyone is always familiar. But you might not be familiar with how many people there are in the states that are doing this. So there are 5.1 million people across public and private lands that are responsible for this work. That is everything from our local open space program to the 6 primary federal land agencies to nonprofits like the Nature Conservancy and all the way down to small ones like land trusts, as well as a huge section of the private sector. So I like to spend some time on this because oftentimes we hear a lot of like big scary negatives. And I'm going to give you some statistics that are some big scary negatives around this, unfortunately. Land managers are getting a lot of pressure right now. So you've probably heard visitation skyrocketing. Visitation has doubled in the last 10 years at Zion National Park, while the staff and the budget have decreased by 25%. Forest fires have doubled since 1980, and the staff for the Forest Service has been cut in half. Invasive species are harder to fight and push back than ever. We just had to drain our first state park. Highline State Park is drained because of zebra mussels now. And biodiversity is continually dwindling across the states. Big, scary negatives. So this is a little unfair for us. Public lands gets a quarter of a penny of a US tax dollar for 600 million acres of our land, despite the fact that outdoor recreation as an industry is 2.3% of the GDP, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. I just like to kind of sit and like let that set in, because that 10x difference between what we are consuming from the outdoors versus what we are giving to it is a really heavy burden that I think can be solved. So why is nature being left behind? This is my little AI generated image of a ranger panicking while he has visitors being chased by wildlife. It's on fire and there's trash everywhere. Simply put, land management is unseen, it is complex, and I would argue it is forgotten by technology. We are kind of viewed as this we'll add it if we can aspect to technology. Even if you use and view Esri as this tool, Esri is, for the most part, the vast majority of users are not nature focused. A lot of the really pretty sparkly graphs that we see from Esri are. So I'm going to go through these examples. Unseen, out of sight, out of mind. I see this with so many people we talk to, where their directors, their city council, whatever it is, they see this beautiful trail and they completely miss the hundreds of hours of work and thousands of dollars that have been put into making it stay natural. It's really tough where, like, in the rest of government, if we give you money, you build a new building, we're like, ooh, shiny building. We can see that on the asset sheet, right? And it shows up in their logs. It's really easy for them to defend. Ideally, 30 years from now, this looks like this, right? And it will likely not look that way if we don't do any of this other work. So if the city council doesn't have any access to this, then this work goes unseen, it goes unrecognized, and it goes unbacked. A challenge that is very unique to stewardship, specifically in the US, is our relationship to private property. We always say stewardship stops at property lines, but ecosystems don't, right? This is something that's really easy to conceptualize, where you have OSMP that backs up to the Forest Service, that it surrounds the National Park Service, and all these other agencies, right? It gets even more complicated than that. Where Pickens County, we ran a stakeholder map with them. There are currently, in our study with them, 113 organizations, not private landowners, organizations and teams that their rangers have to interact with in a given year. This is a crazy amount of human management and relationship management you have to do in terms of how do you know whose property you're on, who to call, who has what information, and how can you possibly think about managing an ecosystem across 113 different people. Lastly, desk work tools are not designed for fieldwork needs. I think if any of you have been rangers, this is a very common thing. We go to these teams and we see stacks of cabinets of forms for the Department of Agriculture that are handwritten forms that never leave that office. We'll end up with 30 plus spreadsheets, all of which are missing the most important aspect of their job, which is the place. It's outside, it's out in the field, right? So technology, they're forgotten by it, they're fighting an uphill battle, and no one is listening. Most people I talk to with ranger teams are stuck doing walkie-talkies, pen and paper forms, and that work never makes it even to their manager, let alone to the director or someone making a decision on how much money they get. It makes it, without this data, it makes it really, really difficult for them to advocate for their work. It makes it harder to do their operations. Pickens County, which is one of the best funded ranger programs I have ever seen, didn't even have access to their property lines while they were in the field, which is an absurd thing to think. If you work for a national park, that might be one thing. You have one parcel and the lines have gates at the end, right? Pickens County didn't even have access to that, and they have so many parcels spread across their entire county. And they do some management outside of their county as well. And then, more than anything, we always talk about how education is so important for visitors. We also understand that stakeholders need that education too, probably. Unfortunately, we have a huge gap between what visitors are understanding and what our stakeholders are understanding for them to back this work. This is all the big, scary, negative stuff that I said I wanted to go through. Now we're going to move on to the fun stuff and the fact that I do not think that that is something we have to live with forever. The importance of data is so that we can get to a future where this is not the case, where we have access to this information and we can move through it, and these are not challenges we need to face anymore. So some of the roles of data. There are a lot of roles of data. Data can do a lot of things in theory. It can communicate across property lines. It can communicate across user groups. It can do a lot of things very easily that used to be very difficult. Something that would take 40 emails, or in Pickens County's case, 113 emails, you can do in a single location. It can inform, it can justify, it can predict, and it can collaborate and adapt. These are things that, if you do it in a spreadsheet, are often almost lost, right? Especially because you don't necessarily know what you're looking for. Sometimes there are spreadsheet, hundreds and hundreds of spreadsheets that you can't collaborate across. Why don't we have this data already? I would argue that there are two primary reasons why this data does not already exist for most agencies that we talk to and work with. One is the organizational challenges. The other are data challenges. The organizational challenges are very simple. These are human systems. We are working with people, and people are complicated, and people don't always want to do things in a specific way or do it 100 times, especially when you have a system that is complicated. If you have people working out in the field, whether they're offline or out in a truck doing whatever, right? This dispersed field team is really hard to work with and communicate with, especially because they are probably swamped. These are probably some of the most busy people in the entire team, constantly trying to fight for traction in what they're doing. They're being orchestrated by their managers from the office, right? Imagine trying to manage a remote team like this from an office. It can be a really complicated job, especially when you have people you also need to report to. A lot of the rangers we talk to end up spending the last 4 weeks of the year only in their office, only working on pulling together and combing through those spreadsheets and forms and files just to go and try to defend the funding they already have, let alone try to get more funding. The directors are often the outward-facing people. They might be working internally and working on decision-making or giving the thumbs up on big projects, right? But a lot of the times, a lot of the work they do is communicating to these stakeholders, justifying that budget, working on big fundraising projects and PR. Being able to communicate across these verticals is really hard because each of these groups has a different need, right? These people need something to do their job out in the field right now. The rangers need those property lines, right? They don't know how to do their job if they don't know whose property they are on. They don't know what jurisdiction they have. Managers have the opposite. They need to understand where all their people are and try to balance the amount of time they have. They know they don't have enough people to do everything that needs to get done. And then they need to be able to feed it to the director, whose job is to orchestrate multiple managers, multiple teams, and try to make decisions and justify funding for their entire organization. I could talk to you about this topic alone for the remainder of the time, but it is very boring and it's mostly me complaining about government software. In short, data is hard for the outdoors because we are using the wrong tools. As I've said, most tools that we end up building miss the most important aspect of the job, which is the place, or they're so isolating that they only work for one individual group. Very frequently, we see organizations spending an absurd amount of money to build something internally that only works for a single section of a group, and it requires other groups to do extra work. That is a huge burden on those other people when they don't have resources to do their own job. I love pointing at this. These are all real things, and it's supposed to look messy and gross because it is messy and gross. So there are 8 primary verticals when we talk about individual trail management, things that can affect individual trails. With our work, we've seen over 416 different, what we call location types, individual pieces of information that are unique to these areas, whether it is ecology, wildfire, utilities, everything from understanding how power lines affect forest density to affect trail closures, down trees affecting agriculture, all sorts of things. It is wild how many individual aspects of a trail get completely overlooked beyond the distance, elevation, use, and views. These details are really important and none of them are isolated. You might only work in visitor education, and even then, that work should probably be informed by what work people are missing. If everyone is out there with dogs off leash and you have no education on dogs off leash, that work's not isolated. All of these are connected to each other, and these teams are not broken out, even though oftentimes we view they are. So I argue this: to solve these problems, you have to make data the default, and you have to make it easy. For Pitkin County, when we started working with them, they had an internal custom tool, they had 15 spreadsheets, and they had a stack of paper forms they had to work with. When they were filling out an individual report, they had to write it in 6 different places. That is an absurd amount of time to spend writing on individual things. If you can just simplify that down to keeping track of it in one place, that is a huge increase for just that individual person. So build simple data creation and management into the workflows, and anytime you see someone doing something twice is an opportunity to improve how you're doing that. This is why we built Outway. Outway is a land management software designed specifically for land managers. Not for land managers to specifically communicate to the public, but for their work and everything it encompasses. We focused on taking all of those tools that they had to use across and putting them into one single flexible spot that would work for multiple teams. In our National Science Foundation research, we interviewed over 400 different agencies, and we had to understand These people have custom work. It's unique in every ecosystem they go into, every community they go into. Everywhere is specific, right? We couldn't build one size fits all for everything, so we built a tool that is flexible so we can make a tool that works perfectly for every use case they're working with. We like to say this, it's all in one place with Outway, because whether you're offline in the backcountry, whether you're orchestrating your team from the office, or whether you're taking reports to City Hall to make decisions, all of this information is in one place, synced together to give everyone what they need where they're at, from those field teams to the managers to the directors. For instance, this is why we're able to do things like asset management. So being able to keep track of all individual field assets in a single place, when they're degrading, their statuses, whether they need to be replaced, you name it. Opening, closing trails, this type of stuff. This is what lets us do wildlife tracking in the same platform, where we can help manage that human-wildlife interface relative to individual people. So whether that's the butterfly pavilion keeping track of invertebrate species across the state, or the city of Aspen keeping track of bears breaking into trash cans. Managing the human-wildlife interface in ecosystem health is incredibly important, and it's unique on a case-by-case basis. Visitor engagement and visitor management. Keeping track of visitor use and, as we'll talk to, behavior is complicated. Outway, I want to clarify, is not an enforcement software, but it is a record-keeping software. And keeping track of these individual records can inform decisions, it can inform laws, it can inform our education, and everything else we do. We have agencies that use Outway as a full CRM, keeping track of every contact they have, from education through volunteers, through enforcement contacts, etc. Pickens County and the city of Aspen have 18,000 contacts that they have kept, or individual people, let alone multiple contacts per person. Maintenance records and maintenance logs. This is the least sexy thing that land management has to do, and it is maybe, in my opinion, the most important. Without this, our resources are going to continue to decline, and we won't be able to keep up with all of those important demands that we're facing from rising visitation. So we have to make sure that that works, even if it's as sexy as cleaning restrooms. Keeping track of that work and being able to document it lets teams not only coordinate how they're spending their time and make the most out of that time, but it also allows them to do even more out there and to go and justify and say, hey, you know, we are cleaning this all the time, and we actually realize that like this vault toilet's not going to work. We have to upgrade our system or something like that and pursue that grant or funding to do those changes. Lastly, project management. Project management is super broad, and there are obviously dedicated project management softwares that are relatively broken out. Something that's unique about Outway is those are built on individual places. So whether that's the person planning a new project or the first people out there doing it, managing it through it's done, through keeping track of the new trail, 10 years down the line. Having all of this told in a single place allows you to connect that story not only from the work that's gone into it, but then tie it into that further maintenance record as you move forward from that initial grant purchase or something like that. I didn't think we had any fun animations. Yay. Okay, I get this question all the time, which is, how is Outway different? If you're familiar with ARC Collector or ARC Field Maps or Survey 123, I would argue that for Outway, we really focus on the individual people and not the people who know GIS. Because in most teams we talk to, there might be one GIS person to 20 people who don't actively use it. So making sure that it works for those other 20 people is really important. While Outway technically manipulates GIS information for locations, I try to tell people it's not that. It's like as complicated to use as Google Maps is. And so if you see Google Maps as a GIS tool, then yes, Outway is a GIS tool. Fitting it into the existing processes. Pickens County needs to keep track of those enforcement records. They need to keep track of the trail damages they see. They need to keep track of their wildlife cameras, etc. Those are processes that already exist. So if we can build into how we fit into those processes so that it's not an additional step, it's not additional work for them, it's a much easier build in for them. Collaborative. This is one thing that makes Outway really unique. Outway has the ability to allow you to collaborate with every single person you want to. I could share my data set with any individual. I could share it with another team. Pickens County, for instance, collaborate on their contact list. I can even share and publish things to the public, volunteer organizations, individual volunteers. having this level of control outside of just an isolated license that you're restricted to gives you a lot more power in how you're able to work, because most of the work you're doing is not just with one agency. Almost always you're going to have someone else involved, whether it's a different organization, volunteers, public, etc. More than a map, location is a piece. Location is very, very important. I would say location is the most important aspect of this job, but it is not everything, and the map isn't everything. Oftentimes the photos, the details, the description, that's really where you're going to make a change, where the actual context is going to come through. You can put a point on a map, but it doesn't mean very much unless it has that weight behind it. And that weight is actually the things that are important about it. Outway really prioritizes building that in. And lastly, as I've mentioned, the flexibility, being able to fit individual teams and grow with them as they grow versus having to do like entire rebuilds every single time you want to change, some custom build you have within your organization, gives us a lot of leverage in terms of making things flexible for organizations as their priorities change, as we learn more about visitation, wildfire, you name it. Is anyone familiar with the Rio Grande Trail in Aspen? This is our use case section. We're entering it. This is the first one. The Rio Grande Trail is one of the coolest recreation assets in the state, in my opinion. It is a 42-mile trail that runs from downtown Aspen to downtown Glenwood Springs. It crosses 3 counties. It has over 30 different landowners on it. It is a logistical nightmare to manage. So Outway aimed to try to help this, where we have really, really complex visitation, including it being a commuter path. We have the rise of e-bikes coming in. We have limited staff across all these areas, and missing context across multiple property owners. This isn't the world's most complicated thing to solve. So we gave their rangers the ability to keep those records, as we said, right? They have now kept records of every single thing that they've done out there. I filtered some of it, so it's not too disgusting. But all of these individual points help them actually indicate what they're doing out in their work every day. And you can see it pretty much creates a little bit of a heat map just straight down that line. Each of those points have details. They have people tagged in them. They have photos attached. They have all of this information across multiple different landowners. Makes it a lot easier to see who is behaving in what way across what property and what are we learning across our community instead of just our property. This makes it really easy for the directors of these two programs to get insights that are actually actionable for them. They can see, okay, we have hit capacity on our parking lots and proven it multiple times with these overflow parking incidents. We have had multiple injuries that we've had to respond to, and here are the reasons and causes for those. Whether this was a lack of education and people got lost, whether people were crashing on a downhill mountain bike trail because the turn was too tight. These are insights that they're able to derive directly from these incidents and see maps related to them, including collaborating with them on the ground and saying, here's our assessment of this. E-bikes and e-bikes incidents. I don't have an opinion on e-bikes either direction. I think e-bikes in some instances are amazing, and I think in other places we have room to learn as a community. But there are a lot of places where e-bikes are actually hurting people because of misuse. Being able to get this information helps them inform all of the different types of things they're doing, whether that's education, signage, restrictions, enforcement. Similar to dogs off leash. Dog off leash and e-bikes, same challenge, mostly an education gap more than anything. And while dogs off leash might not be a huge incident, when you have the information that the dog off leash is chasing wildlife, it's now a much bigger problem. So being able to take that information to use and educate how you're managing your properties is really important. And lastly, this is something that a lot of land management agencies don't have the luxury of. Being able to forecast the damages and replacements for next year is really powerful. And a lot of other agencies in these organizations have this. Public Works has this for roads, for instance. They have degradation measures on roads they keep track of. So being able to bring this type of technology to natural lands that are way less structured than a city street gives us a lot more leverage in terms of forecasting budget for year over year. There is the paradox of information, though. And as a software engineer, I don't know if you'll ever hear this from another software engineer ever again. Software doesn't do anything. Data doesn't do anything. It doesn't do anything by itself. And as the call to action, as I assume again, is going to point out, the narrative that you put behind it and the story you tell is really what's going to get people to understand and drive that decision. Taking these insights Collaborating with them in a way that can help others understand allows others to get behind you, follow your cause, and make decisions with you. This is really important, and it is working for people. The city of Aspen and Pitkin County both were able to use this data and increase the size of their staff and increase their annual funding, which says a lot because they actually have a dedicated tax already. So for them to take even more out of the general fund on top of their dedicated tax was really impressive for them. It also helped them inform 2 new laws on dogs off leash and e-bikes that are tailored to specific instances and backed by the data that they were able to pull. Really important caveat to these 3 examples is these are examples of adding more to your system. More is not always an option. So in the absence of more, data makes it much easier for you to prioritize the highest priority items for your challenges. The more information you have on that, the better you can manage your resources. And in instances like our partners at Lafayette, they don't have the option to pull more funding, but they can be more resourceful with the funding that they do have and prioritize those individual problems and challenges they're facing. At every conference I have ever been at, I hear people screaming about visitation data. People love visitation data. Visitation data is really powerful. What I don't hear people excited about is compliance data. I get that. Compliance is not very fun. Visitor behavior is not always the most fun thing to track. But I think this is a really important conversation to have, which is the balance of capacity versus demand. These 2 data sets do 2 different things, and they can be really powerful in informing various aspects of this. Visitation data, for instance, is one of the best ways to determine the difference between your visitors on tourism versus residents, right? That's incredibly valuable information. Same with demographic information. And of course, your visitor journey can help help you understand where people are going, spending time across individual trails or areas. These things can inform, data but not by itself, can inform these types of actions, right? If you have a good understanding of your visitor breakdown between your tourism and your residents and how they're spending their time on and off the trail, you can inform whether you should try to implement a sales tax or whether you should try to implement a property tax. Or in the instance of, as we're seeing more and more of, whether you need a natural services tax. So Boulder has its wildfire mitigation tax now, right? So the tax structure and revenue attribution is really important. This is where if you can get this data and make these inferences on, hey, we are driving this much revenue to the town, makes it a lot more beneficial for you to build out these outdoor recreation and outdoor resources for yourselves. And especially for destination making, this is really important. Compliance data, way less sexy, but you can learn a lot of actual action items on the ground for them. So for instance, trail and parking capacity. Keeping track of trail and parking capacity can be really difficult. Same with staff capacity in terms of how overwhelmed your staff is. Does anyone know about the project at CU that led to the Bear Creek Reservation program at Rocky Mountain National Park? Everyone's familiar with that reservation, right? That was not a decision based off of visitation data. That was a decision based off of capacity and compliance data. And the reason was the trail can actually handle more capacity. The team that was out there could not repair the trail from off-trail users and clean up trash from users fast enough. So while the parking lot was hitting capacity, the buses were bringing in more and more people, and the rangers physically were just on their heels trying to keep up with it. So that's where a reservation system was an informed action from this data. So restrictions and laws like we talked about with dogs off leash and that sort of thing, as well as demand versus capacity. We are talking to a bunch of Washington state parks right now who are struggling because everyone wants to build new trails and they have no bandwidth to take on additional trails, right? They need an ability to actually show that. They don't even have the capacity to deal with the demand they currently have, let alone take on 50 miles more of trail. So I always recommend start simple. Doesn't mean you have to start with Outway, but pick something simple. There's a ton of tools out there that are free. Working with data is low cost, it is low risk. It should be really easy to implement. And when I pitch this to everyone else, I try to explain that sharing your data and working on data is the lowest effort thing versus doing a project out in the field, doing an acquisition, or in my case, figuring out what's for dinner is increasingly difficult in effort. This is a human challenge. Sometimes the best thing we can do is get out of the way. If we're able to just connect the work that we're doing passively, then we can get out of each other's way and make decisions off the information that we're receiving. Best practices, generally, I love to point out, like, again, building it into existing workflows. The more you can engage those stakeholders without having it to be like pulling teeth or customizing everything for every person you talk to, choosing simple, achievable goals right at the beginning. Pick something easy. When we start working with a new organization, we're not coming in and saying, yay, throw everything away. We're saying, let's pick one thing, let's do it really well first and move forward from there. Bringing down barriers is really why we built Outway to be collaborative, because if you can get more people to be working together across these property lines, that collaborative stewardship aspect becomes much more achievable. And lastly, focus on collaboration over ownership. I actually think OSMP does a great job of that here in Boulder, and it's a phenomenal representation. Not everywhere has the luxury that OSMP does. So when we're working with other agencies across the country or the world, paying attention to how you can engage other people and bring those partners in and pay attention to what's happening on the other side of the fence can help everyone, especially with fire. Bad data, no data. Your problem doesn't exist to other people because they can't see it. You can make data the default and make it easy. It's a much easier process for you, even if that's just like keeping track of your studies out in the field. And lastly, data doesn't do anything by itself. You have to use it to fuel your action. So thank you so much. I have plenty of time for Q&A. So happy to dive into any of the use cases we've seen, talk about any of the stuff that's outside of Outway that we work with or see as well. There's a bunch of work in ecology that we do that I don't have any of the use cases to share on other than what I mentioned about the butterfly pavilion, but happy to dive into any of it.